Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler. When you think of a Japanese watch brand, there are probably three which spring to mind. There are the industrial superpowers of Seiko and Citizen, each with their own innovations and rather impressive capabilities. And then there's Orient. In truth, it would be extremely easy to be profoundly and entirely justifiably harsh to Orient. Their movements are on the whole very antiquated, they lack much of the phenomenal industrial development which has characterised the last 60 years of Seiko and Citizen, and the distribution is a joke. Still, like Lancia and Alfa Romeo of old, people still have an affinity for what is, on paper at least, an inferior product. In this video, I'd like to investigate whether, as its sister brand Seiko rises in quality and international recognition, Orient is gradually losing the plot. Indeed, are Orient watches simply doomed? Before we begin, please remember to like, subscribe and to hit the bell icon if you enjoy this video and would like to see more from Watch Chronicler. Also, to always catch the latest content either here or on watchchronicler.com, the centre of Watch Chronicler content, head over to our Instagram page. This video is sponsored by Aquastar and their remarkable Deep Star diving chronograph, but more on that later. 6 or 7 years ago, I was on the brink of taking the plunge into ownership of my first dive watch, and given that I didn't want to spend any more than £200, I really had only two serious options. The first was the Seiko SKX, an admirable watch with real diving pedigree, as arguably the final example of Seiko producing a watch with no stylistic considerations beyond diving functionality. However, the unique and somewhat specialised appearance of this Japanese icon just didn't sit well with me, and I instead selected an affordable pseudo-dive watch, which was all the rage at the time, the Orient Ray. Now, for those unfamiliar with the Ray, this was an offshoot of Orient's successful Mako, a sub-£200 dive watch with an attitude of all you need, but with a much more classical look than what Seiko could offer you. In many ways, when I bought the Ray, it epitomised just what Orient meant to most buyers. A good value, more conventional looking automatic Japanese dive watch than a Seiko. In the spirit of this, the Ray had the same day-date complication as an SKX, alongside the same luminous brightness and longevity, and the same style of click spring 120-click unidirectional dive bezel. However, it decided to forego the 4 o'clock crown position and gave a more luxurious dial finish with applied markers, an applied logo, and an altogether more Western-looking appearance. There was always one part which gave it away, the pusher at 2 o'clock, which, whilst screwing down, controlled the day-date indicator change. To understand this, and to an extent why I have my doubts about Orient's future, we have to look back at the history of this watch brand. To all intents and purposes, Orient's tenure as a wristwatch manufacturer is somewhat shorter than other long-standing Japanese competitors, including Seiko, its current owner as Seiko Epson. Whilst Orient's roots appeared with its founding in 1901 and its commencement of production of wristwatches in 1934 as Toyo Tokei, the brand went out of business in 1949 amidst the post-Second World War downturn in Japan. In truth, it was with the establishment of the Tamo Keiki company in the same factory as its predecessor in 1950 that Orient, renamed as such a year later, really began. But at this point I need to explain why I've taken you on this rambling historical tale. You see, one of Orient's key failings, in my opinion, is its seeming lack of consistent and attractive design. When you look at Seiko, or to a lesser extent Citizen, watch design is a crisp, modern, and on the whole consistent endeavour. In its most basic form, the 1955 Seiko Marvel is a very good example for the sake of this video. It isn't overly ornate or even overly characterful, yet it represents Japan's forward-looking, industrious attitude perfectly. Of course, for Seiko, this only got better with the implementation of Taro Tanaka's grammar of design, which welcomed clean, reflective and impeccably finished lines into Japanese watchmaking, and helped to put its best foot forward on the international market, where, even in the 1960s, it was becoming obvious that Japan was capable of producing impeccably fine movements. For Orient, however, the emphasis was initially elsewhere. If you're enjoying this video, I suspect that dive watches and the history of subaquatic exploration will be of interest, including work of Jacques Cousteau. Following his joint invention of the aqualung in 1943 with Émile Gagnan, Cousteau's influence on many of our imaginations came with episodes of The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau appearing from 1966 to 76 in its first run. What few may know, however, is that the watch seen in the first episode of this hugely influential series was the Aquastar Deep Star, perhaps the most important diving chronograph of all time, usable down to 100 meters, and with the provision to calculate necessary decompression for consecutive dives. Nevertheless, by the 21st century, the brand had all but disappeared from the diving scene. However, in 2020, under the new ownership of the Synchron Group, the company that brought back icons like the Doxa Sub in the early 2000s, Aquadive and also the Isofrane and Tropic straps, Aquastar is back with the brand new Deep Star, with modern specifications and classical looks. Watch our review to find out more, or head over to aquastar.ch to get your own piece of dive watch history. In 1951, Orient launched their first watch, the Orient Star. This collection was marketed throughout the 1950s and retained an elegant but unimaginative design with elements such as blued 1930s hands and curvy Arabic numerals, as would have been very familiar on an early Patek Philippe dress watch. Additionally, at this time Orient was primarily aiming for the Chinese market after a 1955 agreement, and historically speaking, the Chinese market has not provided anything like the consistency of the Western one. In fact, today China tends to incline towards Swiss watches, if any, in the luxury segment. As such, Orient didn't establish a design heritage in Europe or America, the key markets today for such watches. If you look at the modern Orient Star line, you see well-specified but aesthetically compromised watches with a combination of neo-vintage designs with blued Breguet-style hands and designs which seem perilously close to those pioneered not by Orient, but by Seiko and, again, to a lesser extent, Citizen. Don't get me wrong, there's no harm in being inspired by other designs, but there is if you end up with no recognisable aesthetic of your own. Additionally, if you look at the watches Orient is known for outside the most expensive Orient Star line, you have the various dive and dress watches offered. These are, on the whole, pretty handsome, but also have no unified character. The Ray, for instance, is an obvious allusion to the Rolex Submariner, whilst the Kamasu takes a swing at the Omega Seamaster market. Then the affordable Bambino dress watches continue the same theme, with a fundamentally unimaginative, albeit very appealing design. In short, these are European-looking watches one might buy because they're cheaper than the mainstream counterparts, not because they're Orients, and this really can't help brand power and image. Nevertheless, I would be doing Orient a major disservice by not mentioning their rather wonderful designs, including the Royal Orient, originally launched in 1959 to combat Seiko's more luxurious products, which did introduce some modernity to the brand. In 1965, Orient even released its own, very attractive it must be said, dive watch with an internal bezel and specifications built to compete with Seiko's first, which was released the very same year, the 62 MAS. By the same token, Orient released some really very impressive movements during the 1960s, including the 1967 caliber 3900. This 35 jewel automatic movement was one of the very thinnest movements of its type at the time, at only 3.9mm thick, but again was offered in watches with no seriously recognisable attributes. In fact, Orient even experimented with high beat movements with their 10-beat collection, as was fashionable in the late 1960s and early 70s. In this period, Seiko, Longines, Zenith and even Omega launched high beat movements, and so one can very reasonably see Orient as a forward-looking brand, especially with a unique day-date display and a very striking design. However, from that point forward, Orient really didn't help itself in the pursuit of ongoing, long-term appeal and stature on the same level as its Japanese rivals. Upon reflection, the most minor issue was a stylistic stall at Orient which, by means of extremely gaudy sunburst dials and applied markers, left contemporary watches looking extremely dated today with a very 70s design. More important, however, was Orient's movement choice. Between the 1970s and 1990s, Orient failed to follow its rivals' ventures into quartz technology, and so when those companies were enjoying record sales at the expense of the Swiss, Orient fell into the same boat, despite being just a few miles down the road from the market leaders. Instead of quartz movements, Orient decided to feed its affordable models with a movement which, whilst being praised for being in-house, is actually a hodgepodge of 1960s Seiko parts, and is still being used today. This is the caliber 46943 and its offshoots, which was essentially introduced in the early 1970s from plenty of different Seiko parts with visual similarities to the 7000 and 4200 series Seiko movements, in addition to the automatic winding magic lever of a 6000 series movement. In actual fact, this movement is so old-fashioned that until the mid-2010s, the day of the week was adjusted with a pusher as, when this movement was originally developed and its underpinnings appeared, the day-date complication had no quick-set feature. At face value, however, it's very important not to rush to conclusions, as mechanically speaking, if Orient's basic movement is antiquated, the Miyota 8200 in most affordable mechanical watches is a relic. Even an ETA 2824 is, fundamentally, a very old-fashioned movement. The problem is, though, that an ETA 2824 was a much higher level movement in the first place, whilst Miyota offer a truly modern movement, such as the 9015, which now competes with the aforementioned Swiss offering. Orient, by contrast, doesn't have any such movement, aside from a small-scale Halo model offered for several $1,000s. Of course, in its more modern iterations, as seen in the Mako 2 and Ray 2 watches, hacking, hand-winding and enhanced accuracy improve the package considerably, whilst its more distant relatives in the Orient Star collection present a seriously impressive reworking of what is, at base, a very old movement. For comparison, Seiko's latest movements below the level of the 8L collection made for Grand Seiko are all based, albeit more distantly than the Orient, on the same original movement concepts. The real snag is that, aside from some peripheral movements, Orient didn't develop the range and variety which is needed for an all-conquering brand today. Admittedly, Orient has the endorsement of hardcore Japanese watch fans for making its movements almost entirely in Japan, something which Seiko, for instance, doesn't make any secret of not doing, yet this isn't enough to overcome the issues highlighted above. What I do wonder, however, is to what extent Seiko Epson, Orient's owner since 2009, has influenced the change to upgraded but somewhat antiquated movements. Did Seiko limit Orient to prevent competition? Or was it Seiko's influence before fully integrating the brand in 2017 which drove the creation of Orient's latest movement versions? I simply don't know. Still, whilst it's all well and good to debate the impact of Orient's development over the last few decades, the most important limiting factor on this brand, in my opinion, is its faulty towers style of distribution. A few years ago, buying a Seiko Marine Master 300 in the UK was a nuisance, given the lack of distribution of Seiko's more quote-unquote interesting models. But all things considered, it was only the buying of such a watch which caused any trouble. They were still more than happy to honour the warranty in the UK, and in recent years the brand has come to its senses and now sells almost all of its models over here. The same, however, cannot be said for Orient. When I bought my Ray, I assumed that, like Seiko, getting hold of the Orient saturation diver would be a struggle, but a more common Seiko alternative? Surely not. I was soon surprised to discover that Orient had neither service nor distribution centres in the UK, and after committing to the purchase and having some problems with the movement, that those based in other countries wouldn't talk to me either. Surely this isn't acceptable for such an established brand with a multi-billion-dollar backing. But at this point, it's probably worth qualifying this video to conclude it properly. Let me be clear, my intentions couldn't be further from bashing, as Orient should rightly be seen as a major watch manufacturer, as well as the brand which brought many of us into dive watches and into mechanical watches in general with the Orient Bambino. Nevertheless, putting to one side the relative merits and failings of the different Orient models, many of which are, in isolation, grand, it's hard to see how Orient can develop into the future without the changes already implemented by Seiko. Let me put it this way, I was originally resistant to Seiko's choice to become more available worldwide, with more models catering to the average buyer rather than the JDM importing enthusiast, yet upon reflection, it was undoubtedly the right choice for the brand. Now, whilst there's no real sign of such a change taking root in the imminent future for Orient, the fact that they're trying to reintroduce their historical models suggests a level of self-awareness and the desire to bring back some of their best attributes from the past. Then again, these are rather hit and miss, with the King Diver being pretty fantastic and the SK Retro Diver being, to be kind, rather dismal in both design and quality. I suppose then, it's really anyone's guess. But now I'd like to hand the question over to you. Where do you see Orient as a brand in the future? Is it a brand only really waiting to disappear into the shadow of Seiko Epson, or might it have a few tricks left up its sleeve? Let me know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, share and subscribe to keep the content coming. Thank you very much for watching. This is Armon from WatchChronicler.com. Out.